Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 69 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending September 22, 2017, the Apples and Honey edition. In this week, Jay and I return for a wide-ranging discussion of some of the top compliance and ethics-related stories which occurred over the past week. We talk about the Telia company's settlement of a massive FCPA enforcement action, new concerns about money laundering, and companies who are doing business in Venezuela and what that might mean for them. We talk about an article in The Guardian which discussed an internal probe launched by the EU airplane manufacturer Airbus into an unexplained payment. We take a look at an article by Jacqueline Jaeger from Compliance Week about E&I and its release of new information on allegations of bribery and corruption in Africa. We talk about Compliance Week's editor Bill Coffin's interview of Chen and give our thoughts on that interview. We talk about the details that have come out about the FCPA probe of Uber and how that may impact the company going forward. Jay Rosen comes up with the phrase, switch to lift. We discuss the Astros clinching the NL West and tying, once again, sports to compliance. Take a look at burner phones, Ole Miss recruiting, and its implications for the compliance practice. I review my past week of compliance-related podcasts of 1 month to a more effective compliance program on the Innovation Month. And Jay reviews his upcoming weekend report. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA, a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, this is Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, the only dedicated weekly broadcast about all things FCPA. I'm being joined by my colleague, Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist, and we'd like to welcome you to the Apples and Honey edition, as it is Rosh Hashanah. One of the traditions is eating apples, which are a reminder of a sweet new year, and the honey signifies hope for sweet new things to come. So, Tom, thanks for joining us, and what's happening this week in FCPA?
So, Jay, it may be a good way to end the week with a little sweetness, because we certainly had some untoward and nefarious events happen this week. Maybe we should start with the biggest, which came out yesterday, which was the Telia company, the Swedish telecom company, settled a massive FCPA enforcement action. And when I say massive, I mean to the tune of nearly $1 billion, coming in at $965 million. The settlement was $548 million in criminal penalties to the Department of Justice, $457 in profit disgorgement to the SEC. And while that adds up to 1.05 billion, 40 million of the disgorgement is offset by a $40 million forfeiture to the Department of Justice. So Dick Cassidy estimated the total penalties came in at $965 million and $965.6 million. There is going to be some amount of payments to the Swedish and Dutch authorities, which will be credited against the settlement. So we don't know what those are at this point. But it's just a huge settlement of a massive systemic, literally to the senior executives and top board of directors of the company bribery scheme. It involved bribery of government officials in Uzbekistan. Our old friend Gulnara Karimova, the daughter of the former president, who was doling out telecom licenses, as we saw with Vimpelcom. And she was paid about $335 million in bribes by Telia over a multi-year period. The company got an initial license and then 2 upgrades to move to a 3 and 4G network. So I've explored the basic background facts in my blog post today, and I'm going to explore some of the detail of the bribery schemes because they were quite sophisticated, and the lessons learned for the compliance practitioner going forward. The case also had a kleptocracy component because under the Kleptocracy Act, The Department of Justice had won a $30 million impound award back in 2015 for bank accounts linked to Karamova at the Bank of New York Mellon in various locations. And also in 2014, Swiss prosecutors seized about $820 million as a part of a money laundering investigation into Karamova. So huge amount of corruption in Central Asia for multiple years. A massive FCPA settlement from the Department of Justice. Dick Casson put it as the number one FCPA settlement of all time, exceeding the Siemens settlement. While Siemens was a total settlement of $1.6 billion, only $800 was for FCPA sins. So I guess it's appropriate to talk about sins today. Telia coming in number one at the FCPA of all time. I think it puts it number 4 on the top 10 international list under JBS from Brazil, from Odebrecht from Brazil, Siemens from Germany, and now Telia's. I guess the quick, we really probably don't have time to go into the details of the bribery schemes, but the one theme that I think, Jay, is the most overarching is it demonstrated the international component of enforcement. And we certainly were aware of that from statements by Kara Brockmeyer when she was with the Department of Justice, with the Securities and Exchange Commission. She made at the ACI National Conference, and Dan Kahn made similar statements in multiple Department of Justice and SEC representatives. But if you look at both the DOJ and SEC press releases, you still see a plethora of enforcement officials and prosecutorial offices literally from across the globe. Obviously, you had the Dutch and Swedish, but you also had prosecutors in Norway, prosecutors in Switzerland, prosecutors in Latvia, help from regulators and law enforcement officials in France, Spain, Hong Kong, the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom, the British Virgin Island Financial Services Commission, the Cayman Islands, the Bermuda Money Authority, Cyprus Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Central Bank of Ireland. Here in the United States, we had the IRS and Department of Homeland Security were specifically acknowledged to have been involved. And then finally, in addition to the fraud section, which the FCPA unit falls under, the DOJ money laundering and asset recovery section was involved. So literally investigations and now enforcement across the globe, a huge case. We're going to be unpacking this one for quite some time. Kudos to Dick Casson for breaking the story yesterday. As usual, he's the lead blogger on these things. So a really interesting case that we'll be talking about for some time. And they're going to need a monitor. So there.
Well, I don't know about that, Tom, because I looked at the DPA, and it says in there, as of right now, that based on the company's cooperation, no monitor is being required. Right. And I don't know if we have a chance to unpack that on today's episode, but I believe with the other large telecom matter, VimpelCom, they did get a monitor. Is that correct?
They did. Yeah. Maybe that speaks to the level of cooperation that Telia engaged in. We should note that the fine and penalty, even as high as it was discounted 25% off the bottom end of this range as suggested by the U.S. sentencing guidelines. And specifically, it was discounted for the company's cooperation in the investigation and their remediation going forward. The company did not self-disclose, so they were not eligible for any additional credit. Nevertheless, with that and without requiring a monitor, certainly communicates that the company is moving forward in a way the Department of Justice is certainly recognizes.
Yeah, so I think from a company perspective, that is a positive thing. And the one point that I wanted to just reinforce is if there was any doubt about global cooperation happening on the anti-corruption front, I think the Telia matter does a good job of dispelling that. So, again, sometimes we focus on numbers and settlements and what's happening, but when you get a blockbuster like this and it shows all the global interagency cooperation, I think that's a good thing for us to be looking at in terms of global anti-corruption cooperation.
Jay, next I wanted to talk about a very interesting advisory sent out by the Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Network, or FinCEN. And there's really two parts to it. The first part is that FinCEN wants banks and U.S. commercial entities to be aware of who they're doing business with regarding Venezuela. Obviously, the Venezuelan corruption situation is quite high, and political relations between our countries are, if not at the low ebb, certainly moving in that direction. And the sanctions, state of sanctions between the United States and Venezuela is fluid, even as we speak today. But the second part of this is, in addition to putting banks and other commercial operations on notice, that the FinCEN advisory seemed to indicate that they wanted banks to look out for transactions which would show signs of any link to Venezuelan corruption. And I found that part very interesting. If you are in an FCPA investigation, certainly the Department of Justice expects you to cooperate fully in that we're aware of. And we're certainly aware of self-disclosure. But I don't think we have been aware that the government has asked banks and or companies to be aware of and be on the watch for links to corruption. Suspicious activity reports have been part of the banking regime for some time, so perhaps you can say that's looking for corruption. But here I found this very interesting, that because of the crisis between the two countries, that FinCEN would really reach out and utilize private players to help enforce an anti-corruption program against the country of Venezuela.
I think it's also very interesting that they've gone out and outlined certain countries where there might be, actually not countries, actually certain states within the U.S. where there might be issues of former Venezuelan government officials buying hard assets such as real estate in South Florida and Houston. Not so sure the real estate's hot in Houston right now, but there are several red flags that are enumerated in this article. To your point about trying to be on the lookout for any type of schemes run by members or former members of the Venezuelan government.
Next, I saw a very interesting article by a couple of reporters in The Guardian, a UK publication. David Pegg and Rob Evans wrote about an investigation that the EU airplane manufacturer Airbus started after a Guardian expose. But the thing that really struck me was that the investigation was on an unexplained, and I put that in quotes, 16 million euro payment. And it was not clear, because the payment was unexplained, it was not clear who it was for, what it was for. Obviously, if a payment of that nature is made, it could certainly be part of a bribe or a bribery scheme. But the thing that really struck me, Jay, was the document part. If you have an unexplained payment, that's now enough to initiate an investigation. And it really speaks to the need for robust internal controls, accurate financial records, both required under the FCPA. So kudos to the reporters for picking this up, and we'll have to see how that plays out going forward.
Definitely. Next up on our list, we have our good friend Jacqueline Jaeger taking a look at some information released about the Italian energy company ENI, and looking at multiple places where they have global corruption issues.
So let's set the stage here a little bit, because ENI was the first company literally across the globe to receive an ISO 37001 certification. So ISO has touted that as proof of the efficacy of their standard. E&I received that standard approximately 2 weeks before the current CEO and former CEO were criminally indicted for paying bribes to secure contracts in Libya. Now we have Jacqueline reporting that E&I itself has released additional corruption allegations involving companies' actions in Nigeria, Iraq, Kazakhstan, Algeria, and the Congo. And a number of people obviously involved in this have grown, and both the Italians and other international regulators and prosecutors are taking a look at this. The former CEO and another senior manager are under investigation as well. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see. And certainly you have to wonder about the value of a ISO 37001 certificate when all of this is going down with E&I. So there's
Good
another
question.
article in Compliance Week that I think kind of caught your eye and actually caught a lot of people's eyes, Jay, and that was Bill Coffin, the editor of Compliance Week. He interviewed Chen, and I was wondering what your thoughts on the interview were, particularly with some of the other public comments Chen has made.
Yeah, I mean, she's really, a thought leader out there in this field. And a couple points that I wanted to touch on, and we'll see if they resonated with you, is at one point during this interview with Bill, she talked about that, there really shouldn't be, quote unquote, specific ethics and compliance training, but this should be really rolled up more into a quote, how you do your job, unquote, training. So at one point in this article, she was asking somebody, did you train on this? And they said, well, it wasn't a regulatory issue, so we didn't do any training. So her, I think, hypothesis now is that there are a lot of people who are prosecutors out there that know what to look for, but the people who are in the U.S. regulatory agencies do not know what those same things are. And you really need somebody who not only understands the business application of some of these red flags that you need to look for, but you really have to, as you've said ad nauseum, you have to bake your ethics and compliance controls into your daily business operations. So I think those would be the broad comments that I took from it. But, once again, Wei is really showing that she thinks a lot about this. And I think she is somebody that potentially can be a great bridge for the ethics and compliance community, because she understands this both from a business perspective and also what kind of prosecutions were happening at the DOJ when she was there.
Right. So I certainly picked up on the training comments as well. And I guess my broad thoughts on the interview was her continued advocacy of operationalization of your compliance program. She obviously talked about that significantly in the evaluation of corporate compliance programs document released by the Department of Justice in February, which, it turns out, Jay, she wrote it actually, I think, first draft in December 2015. So she was talking to her fellow prosecutors in the Department of Justice fraud section for 2 years about operationalizing compliance. And I think that message that she was trying to communicate certainly resonated with prosecutors. And when the prosecutors start communicating that out to companies, that's really where a change can be made. And if you've talked to anyone who went in front of Chen during her time with the Department of Justice, you know that she wanted to see what was not just what was your compliance program, but what was the data? What did the numbers show? What did your analysis show? And then taking it a step further, how did you loop that information back into your program in a feedback loop so you could improve it? So that alone would have put her as someone that has really moved the compliance profession forward. But I think she did that in conjunction with several other initiatives at the Department of Justice, and now with her private practice is really going to elevate the role of the chief compliance officer and the compliance profession. The other thing about her interview is she broadened it to compliance and ethics specifically. And that's another concept that she talked about. She talked about it during the spring, and the ethical component of how you do business. And I don't want to say that that's not rocket science. Maybe I should. Maybe it's not rocket science. But to getting employees thinking about doing the right thing from the ethical perspective, if you do that, I think compliance will largely flow from that. So it's going to be interesting to help her explore these issues. I'm certainly going to write about it, podcast about it, and think about it, and look forward to seeing what additional public comments she might make. There was
next on our list,
from our friends
Tom,
at Uber.
have you? Yeah, I was going to say, I still took an Uber this week coming back from the airport. I'm wondering if you're ready to shift to Lyft yet.
Shift to Lyft. Man, that may have to be the name of an episode. The Shift to Lyft. Maybe you should trademark that. Shift to Lyft. Jay Rosen, retired Mr. Monitors, now trademark guru extraordinaire. Shift to Lyft, folks. The Uber is under FCPA investigation. We knew that, but we had some Reuters, David Ingram, reported on some of the specific details. And frankly, Jay, they look to be, I don't want to say routine, but in the nature of facilitation payments, in the nature of donations to charitable enterprises, and donations to government initiatives, sort of a CSR kind of component, corporate social responsibility. Given the culture of Uber, I would have to opine that it's not surprising that they would engage in FCPA violations, but the information we've seen so far in the public record about what the allegations against them are is not something that I think would cause a lot of heartburn. Now, having said that, it may be because Uber has engaged in such nefarious acts with Graystroke, with the Hell program, with its alleged attempts of theft of intellectual property from Google, and other detailed nefarious acts. You know, perhaps payments like this might be questioned and might not pass FCPA muster, but they're really at the start of the investigation, and until we see something significantly more different, I don't think we just have to wait. But in breaking news today, Jay, the City of London canceled Uber's license and gave them basically 3 weeks to appeal. And Uber, of course, attacked the City of London, saying that they were Luddites and they were just protecting the black cabs of London and not the black cabbies, the black cabs, the traditional cabs in the City of London. But if the reason the license was revoked was that Uber was not fit to hold a license. And, you know, that's certainly a valid interpretation, I think, by a regulator at this point, given all we know about Uber. And if fit for purpose has an ethical component, Uber might fail that. And if they have not thought about that, they sure better think about it going forward. It's not just the shift to Lyft. It's are you ethical enough to hold a license to drive a taxi cab? And that's a pretty low bar.
Yeah, and I think that all comes down to the reputational risk that's always talked about, that, you know, if you're under investigation, you know, you're considered innocent until proven guilty. But if a company now has 4 successive concurrent investigations going on into their business practices, if I was a city and I was granting a license, I might think, as you are saying, that they're thinking that the company may not be fit to conduct business in a way that's fair and equitable to other people within that industry. So to be continued. And the article briefly just took a look at the potential investigative and different costs that Uber may start to be undergoing as they're hiring law firms and investigators. So that will be something that maybe we'll start seeing being tallied on a quarterly basis, like some of the other investigations that have happened over the years.
Indeed. So next up, I have to give a shout out to the hometown heroes, Houston Astros, who have clinched the AL West. Perhaps we might have a real old-fashioned Donnybrook with the Astros and the Dodgers, a hated team here in Houston from when they used to stomp on us back in the day. But kudos to the boys. They're in the playoffs, and where they go with Justin Verlander, hopefully far. But that really led me to a exploration, Jay, of another intersection of sports and compliance. And I know are you a retired or recovering screenwriter? I can't remember.
Recovering.
Okay. So I think in the screenwriting world, you could not write about this stuff because as with fiction, you have, if you write fiction, it has to make sense. Well, some of this stuff you can't make up. And so Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, is under scrutiny for recruiting scandal. And the head coach was fired in July after it turned out that he had used state-owned or, state-paid-for cell phones to call to obtain escorts through an escort service. Both he and the state originally claimed that it was just a mistaken dialing, which sent him to these escort service numbers. It turns out there was a pattern and practice of this over many years. Now there's allegations, Jay, that not only the former head coach, but his staff used burner phones, and the burner phones were used in the recruiting process. So if I had told you that burner phones were used in recruiting to set up escorts for high school kids underage, you would have just looked at me and said, Tom, we have this padded room here and we're going to just let you sit in there. And we have this little white jacket for you. And you just sit in here and rest. It was just incredible. But from the compliance angle, Jay, if assistant coaches are using burner phones in recruiting, what's keeping business development people from using burner phones to communicate to further bribery schemes? So maybe there is a screenplay there. I don't know.
Well, you're certainly taking it offline, and I think one of the points you make in your article is that whereas emails are easily tracked, it's a bit harder to be tracking conversation or texts between phones unless you've got some type of warrant to be doing so. And I don't know how you would, be able to capture these burner phones. How did they actually know that they existed? Is it from the former head coach's testimony, or did they actually find receipts where they were using programs' money to go out and buy the burner phones?
So that's part of the other part of this really unbelievable story is the current or the most recently fired coach was Hugh Freeze. And when the recruiting allegations came up, Freeze and university officials accused the prior head coach, Houston Nutt, N-U-T-T, of causing the recruiting violations. Well, Nutt turned around and sued for defamation. And as part of that initiative, his lawyer has put forward an affidavit alleging the burner phone issue, and that's how it came about. The affidavit has not been made public, so we don't know the details as yet. But lots of lessons learned for the lawyers out there. Don't be defaming prior coaches because they can turn around and sue your ass. And don't forget that when you work for a big public school football program, you're a state employee. So all of those records are subject to the Open Records Act. So they can do a lot of discovery without even having to file a lawsuit. In fact, that's how they found out Hugh Freeze had been calling escort services because they got his phone records through a state of Mississippi FOIA request. So really interesting. It's going to be interesting to watch that one going forward. But you're absolutely right. How do you monitor that as a compliance professional? Do you need to add a new line to your annual attestation that you not only have not violated the FCPA, but you haven't used any burner phones in any sales initiatives? I don't know.
So I'd like to quote one more great paragraph that I liked in it. For the chief compliance officer and compliance professional, there are some interesting lessons to be garnered from the weirdness at the University of Mississippi. The first lesson is when sales spike up from the ashes to the heights that the Mississippi football team achieved over the past few years, you might want to check into the reasons. Ole Miss football had not been relevant for many years, and under Coach Freeze, quote, brought top-ranked recruiting classes to Ole Miss, beat Alabama in back-to-back seasons, and won the Sugar Bowl just 2 years ago. There might be a reason other than superior coaching for this renaissance. So if you have a sales spike in a region, which for 30 years or so has been and also ran in marketing, you might want to inquire into what caused the change.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
In fact, you did.
There we go. So, Jay, I'm continuing my monthly podcast series of 1 month to a more effective compliance program. Here in September, we're looking at innovations in your compliance program. Over the past week, I looked at super forecasting, the OODA feedback loop, one of my favorite words, real-time versus right-time monitoring, improvisation, and putting compliance at the center of business strategy. Next week will be the final week of this month. In this month's sponsor has been Oversight Systems. It's available on the FCPA Compliance Report website, iTunes, Libsyn, YouTube, and JD Supra. If you haven't checked it out, I hope you'll do it. It's really put some interesting, innovative techniques in there. And as a compliance practitioner, let me just leave you with this. When it comes to innovation, you are only limited by your imagination. So, Jay, I know it's a pretty important week in your heritage. Will you be having a weekend report, or will you be spending time thinking about the family?
I think I owe my readers last week's report that never came out because I was in the Berkshires. So I'm going to contemplate the stories we tell again and see if I can get that right up. And I think we've got everything on our list here. I guess the one thing that you and I should talk about, and I don't know if it's if we need to put anything on the line, but Texans Patriots this weekend. Any thoughts on which way that's going to go?
Well, the line is 14, so I think that about says it all.
All right, but it's. I guess the Pats looked more like the Pats last week, but I think there are a lot of people on IR. And, if you've got the J.J. Watt factor, I think 14 is a lot of points, but I guess we can talk about that next week. Tom, any conferences, any travel on your end that we need to make anyone aware of?
Nope. Just getting ready for SCCE, Compliance and Ethics Institute in Las Vegas, October 15th through 18th. If you haven't signed up, please do so. It's one of the top compliance conferences annually. It's expected to have over 2,000 people. It's at Caesar's Palace. It is a great fun, great time to be with some great friends. They have a great sports book if you're interested in that. I know I will be there busily watching football games on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday when I'm not conferencing. So please join Jay and I at the SCCE 2017 Compliance and Ethics Institute. And that's, I think, my speaking engagement right now in October, Jay.
Great. So since I did the intro, would you like to bring us on home?
So for Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, this is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist. Thank you for joining us for the Apples and Honey edition this week in FCPA for the week ending September 22, 2017. We hope you will join us again. Thank you. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, we hope that you would rate our podcast. As it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only weekly podcast in FCPA compliance and ethics. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can reach Jay Rosen at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. Thank you again for listening. I hope you will join us next week for another episode of This Week in FCPA, a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.